Welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. I haven't been entirely. I'm recovering from a bout of COVID that I caught about a week ago, actually, which is one reason why I put together a somewhat shorter than usual episode today. The other reason, actually, is that it occurred to me that it would be good to go into a bit more depth on something that I kind of touched on in the last episode. You might remember that last time I talked about how these different approaches to Plato each seem to be underlain by different assumptions about the point of philosophy in the first place, whether it's more about, on the one hand, the construction of a system of thought that would explain everything, including how we ought to live, or on the other, the construction of a set of rules for thinking well. Perhaps, to put it really crudely, on the one hand, something that would supposedly give us answers, versus on the other, something that would supposedly empower us to evaluate or properly test answers. And I mentioned how we might seem to be at a kind of impasse there because these two different ideas of philosophy, basically the continental and Anglo-American, both seemed to have merit, but they also seemed irreconcilable with one another. And then finally I said I thought Plato himself held the key to getting us out of this impasse, and that I'd talk about that next week, which is now this week. But today I wonder if I could beg your indulgence a bit in putting back my discussion of Plato's solution of the impasse to next week's episode, because I'm not sure if I really explained why I feel this impasse is so important. I want to say, first of all, that I don't think we have much hope without philosophical system. We all have worked out for ourselves to greater or lesser detail and at greater or lesser levels of our awareness, I think, some kind of system. We all have worked out our reasons to believe in these various things we believe in. And these systems or structures serve kind of like trellises on which we train the green tendrils of meaning and hope in our lives. I don't see how mere rules of thinking can build up anything like this. They can only let something stand or tear it down. They can't build anything up. And indeed, Wittgenstein closed his 1921 Tractatus, one of the most influential works behind the Anglo-American philosophic movement, with the statement, famously, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." And so that's the famous the sort of radical skepticism in a way that underlies the Anglo-American approach. The second thing I wanted to say, though, is that it's not really enough to say that system building has the potential to be problematic merely. Definitely it is, because as I mentioned last time, our concepts, these, in a way, fictions of ours, can clearly never entirely capture reality. Or perhaps better put, they're always going to be out of context, because abstraction is precisely taking something out of context. Abstractions are necessarily a kind of removal, of a kind of drawing from reality. We are always trying to fix on something that is this and not everything else. That's where the word abstraction comes from, this Latin ab and traho, to pull away from. As Goethe wrote in his Faust, "Gray, dear friend, is all theory, but green is the golden tree of life." And that's Mephistopheles speaking, who gets the best lines. I'm also reminded here of that wonderful poem Postscript by Seamus Heaney. To rather awkwardly slice off a hunk of that poem by quoting a few lines out of their context, he writes, "Useless to think you'll park and capture it more thoroughly." You are neither here nor there, a hurry through which known and strange things pass. And so, in a way, our concepts will always be insufficient to capture reality. Something's always going to get lost in translation. But there's one area, I think, where this insufficiency becomes actually very dangerous, and that is in the area of human desire, how we conceptualize what it is we want, the object of our desire, the good. Earlier in this series, I mentioned another wonderful quote from the Bengali writer Rabindranath Tagore. He wrote, this was back in 1916 in a novel, "Man's life was not meant to be cast in a mold, and if we try to shape the good as so much mere material, it takes a horrible revenge by losing its life." So, by treating the good as a material to be shaped, I think he's talking here about trying to delineate it by figuring it out, I think, isn't he? Basically making it conform to fit a philosophical system. And this is the problem with system and desire. A closed philosophical system seems bound to frustrate our desire because the more it tries to explain what would make us happy, the more it tries to delineate it, the more it limits it. The more it tries to delineate it, the more it limits it. But there seems by nature something limitless about human desire. I still haven't found what I'm looking for is really, of course, a song for all of us. But the threat posed by trying to live by our philosophical systems goes beyond the problem of the mere frustration of desire. The real danger is the creation of private and public hells. I've spoken before about the glory of thinking, and I think one of the most glorious moments we know is the articulation to ourselves of the good. That moment we on some level think about something, I love this. That is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But when the psyche, for some reason, is deaf to that other voice of truth inside, that moment of disillusion, when we also realize on some level that neither this nor any other this is going to satisfy us ultimately, when we realize on some level that the good is losing its life because we have tried to shape it. When we're deaf to that, what we seem to do is go back to pursuing that this with a kind of fanaticism, an irrational zeal, like that of an addict in search of the intensity of the first high. This is what we see, for example, in the Inferno of Dante. The principle, really, of Dante's City of the Damned is that the object of human desire has been conceptualized in a fixed way, without any accompanying sense of disillusion, that sense of disillusion that might point to the inadequacy of any of these finite things: sex and romance, food, money, political power, etc., to satisfy human desire. But without this sense of inadequacy, these souls seem to be capable of nothing other than a fanatical pursuit of the good as they've narrowly conceived it, and one that blinds them to anything else. The hollowness of the satisfaction they get from it has the potential to spur them to ever greater depravity, which is a theme also of the last couple of books of Plato's Republic. And when the good that we conceive is a communal one, the kind of answer that ideology gives us, for example, when we see this same addictive pursuit, then we see this same addictive pursuit play out communally. And of course, these fanaticisms of left and right are not something we left behind in the 20th century, but probably belong more broadly to modernity, which, at least as far as we've been able to conceive it so far, seems to necessitate finite measurable conceptions of the human good. And I wonder if that's really the central riddle that modernity is trying to wrestle with. Everybody wants a secular society, but how do you have a secular society that is not stuck to finite conceptions of the good? Anyway, to sum up, human beings seem to depend on philosophical system to articulate their hope and give it life, but at the same time, the apparent closedness of systematic thinking also seems to hold the potential for the greatest misery and evil. So this is the impasse I was trying to talk about last week, but perhaps didn't succeed in really bringing out what I felt was the importance of. And the great hope that Plato holds out to us, as I mentioned then, is of solving this impasse. And I'll talk about that next week, how he does that. Anyway, hope to see you then, and thanks for watching.